Bueno, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes. Soy Vidal Romero, me acompaña Athanasios Hristoulas, mejor conocido en los bajos mundos del ITAM como Saki. Y Saki va a hablar el día de hoy sobre la administración de Trump y sobre todo las implicaciones para seguridad nacional en México. Esperemos que esto nos dé un poquito de certeza para ver si abandonamos el país o no pronto. Entonces, bueno, pues adelante, Saki. Saki hablará por unos 40 minutos o algo así, y después tendremos comentarios, preguntas y respuestas. Si hay algo muy urgente, podemos interrumpir. Adelante. Gracias.
Yeah, thank you, Vida. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me. And if Jorge is out there somewhere in the virtual world, hey, Jorge. But on the issue of interrupting and just whenever you feel like that. I mean, we're a small group, so by nature, this is much more. It's friendly. It's a much more open to an open discussion. And I was gonna make a couple of age jokes. The first one was that this is one of the few times I don't actually come with prepared notes, because the last like 6 or 7 talks that I've given, it's like I always have the typed out prepared notes and I never use them, which means I've gotten to that point in my life that yes, it's gonna happen to you. Trust me, you'll know what I mean in about 30 years ago. But the age joke that I was gonna make, but it's not really an age joke, it's a compliment / age joke, assuming Jorge is there, is that Jorge and I know each other for over 30 years, close to 30 years. We met in the 90s when he first started working at CESIG. And so our friendship and even our professional relationship to some extent began at that point. And so Jorge and I are old, is what I'm trying to say, and I hope you heard that. And Jorge was older than me back then, so that means Jorge is older than me now, mathematically. But that was the funny part. But the nice thing I wanted to say about that was that I remember back then in the 96, 97, 98, somewhere around there, CESIG had started opening up. Jorge, in fact, was very crucial in opening up CESIG as an institution. And I'm proud to actually say that I'm the first foreigner that was invited, not to give a conference, because they would always invite people from the CIA or whatever to go give a conference at CESIG and stuff like that. But in terms of like going to get there and give them a class on, like give them a course on game theory or something like that. I was actually the first foreigner to ever like give courses at CESIG. Maybe it's because I'm Canadian and they trust me because of that. I wonder if the same would have applied if I was an American. But and that's the other thing I want to, subtitle all of this is that I'm Canadian. So remember, I'm the 51st state, and I'm really offended, of course, by the 51st state thing that Trump is doing. I think we really should we deserve at least 4 states, 55 states. But so I understand that I'm a Canadian, and that's going to be important because of some of the things I'm going to say. Because at some points it may sound, but I'm not doing it, but it may sound as though I might be defending some of these policies. And the last thing before I begin is that, when I was looking at the description and the title, like there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, there's national security, there's borders, there's Trump, there's immigration, it's like everything. And I was like, how do I organize all of this together? And the thought, what came to mind was to use the border as the organizing principle, to bring all these different aspects together. And what we have is, obviously we have a very complicated situation at the border. We've had, and that's the important part, I think that should be highlighted. The border issue that's being highlighted now with Trump. Also in the case of Canada as well, by the way. It's not only in the case of the United States, it's not only in the case of Mexico, but the border thing, whatever you want to, the national security aspect of it, or the security aspect of it, or the criminal, or the great, whatever, this is not a new thing. This is something that's been going on for a very, very long time. This is something that, I mean, I'm not gonna, it's kind of hard to pick a date, but I remember having these kinds of discussions about the border between Mexico and the United States in the 80s. So, yeah, I mean, we are talking 40, 45 years. The discussion has evolved, and what I wanted to tell you about is how that discussion has evolved after having looked at this topic for, by the way, do you mind que está como mezclado español, inglés, okay, I'll swear in Spanish, but I'll speak in English. The issues along the border have evolved, and that's kind of what I wanted to walk you through, how the issues have evolved and where we got to where we are today and why we got to where we are today. And I don't think it's an exclusively Trump thing. So I want to walk you through the evolution of these discussions on the border, how they started, why they started, how they evolved, how they changed, and then get us to where we are right now. And you know, you can kind of divide the period up, at least the way I see it. I mean, I kind of divide it up into there's 4 stages. There's the first stage it takes us to about the 90s. When we think about North America as almost only an economic space, and essentially much of what has to do with the border revolves around economic issues. I'll explain to you what I mean by that in a moment. Although I understand, of course, you know, actually the big drug issue in the 70s and the 80s, and maybe even early 90s on the Mexico-US side is mostly marijuana. I mean, we're not, coke is starting to make its introduction in the late 80s after Miami Vice failed as a TV show. But that's not until like late 1980s. If we're going to talk about like a drug issue that was on the U.S.-Mexico agenda in the 70s and the 80s, it was primarily marijuana, not exclusively, but it was primarily marijuana. And I mean, that was honestly probably the secondary issue in the bilateral relationship as far as the border is concerned. The primary issue back then, and you could see this from you have to be as old as I am to remember these debates, these presidential debates in the 1980s in the US, where they're arguing about the border. I mean, they've been arguing about the border in presidential primary debates since the 80s. And I remember seeing a debate between Reagan and Bush over the primary, the Republican primary. And they're debating the border, but what they're debating the border has nothing to do with drugs. It has nothing to do with Mexicans stealing jobs either, which was the one it had to do with Mexicans using up American resources like medical resources or going to schools that they get to go to, they come here illegally, they go to our schools, they go to school for free, and then they go to the hospital, and then they use our medical, and who pays for that? And that was the debate in the 1980s. And of course, that was complemented by the fact that they're coming here and they're stealing our jobs. So the big 80s thing was they're stealing our jobs. It was an economic thing. I know I'm overgeneralizing because I only have like 30, 40 minutes, but essentially you can reduce it to just that. 70s, the drug issue was brought in, as I'm sure you're familiar with Nixon, with the war on drugs. But that was almost exclusively on the issue of marijuana, which only emphasized this idea that if there was a drug problem on the border, it was marijuana. And I'm not saying that they were particularly effective, in catching the marijuana, but it's a lot easier to control the entry of marijuana than it is to control the entry of something like fentanyl or even cocaine for that matter. So it progressively evolved into something else. So we start in the 70s, 80s, marijuana, but economics, right? I mean, basically an economic issue. The border is an economic issue. It's an open border, it's an economic issue. And one of the things that Reagan did was the mass amnesty in the late 1980s under the promise to Congress that he would harden the border. So that's the first time we started hearing these phrases, hardening the border. We have to do something about the border. Because before that, and you can ask your parents about this, there was a border, but there wasn't. I mean, ask your grandparents perhaps. People who used to live along the border, they would go back and forth on a daily basis. I mean, you have people living in Juarez, crossing over into El Paso, working in El Paso, coming back the same day. There was a chain fence and stuff like that, but it was full of holes and stuff like that. But some of the pictures you see now where you have it basically looks like Afghanistan in Arizona was not the case. It simply wasn't the case in the 70s or the 80s for that matter. But when Reagan cumple su promesa that he's going to do something about the border, all of a sudden makes it harder for Mexicans to come back. So Mexicans used to spend a lot of time going into the US and coming back in the evening. Then with the wall, or the beginning of the wall, the Reagan wall, they go into the US and they stay in the US because if they come back, they may not be able to get back in again. So at the end of the day, the migration crisis, in a way, was created by the creation of a wall. If you had not put a wall there, Mexicans would continue living on the Mexican side because they would much rather live on the Mexican side for obvious reasons, and live on the US side and go back and forth. And that's the way it was. Oversimplified. I understand that. But so that brings us up, I think up until the 90s, you know, in the 90s, we signed NAFTA in 94, in 93, 94. And the only thing that it really does is it multiplies the idea, the effect of the idea that North America is an economic space. So everything that has to do with North America is economic. I mean, the cultural linkages are cultural linkages, not necessarily between the border regions, but cultural linkages are, we don't talk about those kinds of things. When we talk about NAFTA, when we talked about NAFTA back then, it was about how we were going to make North America a competitive space, geographic space, to go up against the other regional blocs that were emerging at the time. The big one, of course, being the European Union. Again, to emphasize the idea that economics is what's dominating everybody's thinking. And you know, if I was to pick a point at which like everything changed, and now all of a sudden this idea of security gets introduced to the border, like in a very kind of direct and unexpected way, because we've never really thought about security. At least I can say that for sure from a Connect to Canada US side, we never thought about the border as a security issue. And from what I remember, yes and no in the case of Mexico, like I just explained. 9/11. 9/11 changes everything. 9/11, yes, the border is an economic space. The border is the place where we're trading, but the border is also a potentially dangerous place where there's criminals. And the criminals that they're talking about in 9/11 are terrorists. So all of a sudden, the border becomes a national security issue. And I guess that links up one of the topics of discussion was we never really used the word national security in reference to the border until after 9/11. Until the Americans started using the word national security in reference to the Americans didn't use national security in reference to the border, really, not until after 9/11. And of course, the concern was not that Mexican criminals or anything like that. See, that's going to come later. You know, those rapists and murderers and all that kind of stuff, that's going to come later. The concern in 9/11 is that because the two borders, both Canada, US, and Mexico, US borders are so porous and they're different natures for different reasons, that it's going to make it easy for terrorists to cross over from one side into the other side, that, you know, Islamic terrorists are going to use Mexico or they're going to use Canada and the porosity of the border to cross over into US territory and attack the United States. So the border becomes a national security issue, but it becomes a national security issue, but from a terrorist point of view. Not from murderers, rapists, etc. The way it's been framed in recent years, and the concern, and some of these concerns were just absolutely insane. And most American, that's the big difference, I guess, between now and back then. You know, you had Bush and some members of his cabinet back then talking about the potential for terrorists coming from Mexico into the United States. But the people on the ground, the people who were there, who were watching the border, or mid-level policymakers and decision makers, if you were to ask them, you know, are you worried about Islamic terrorists coming over the border from Mexico? They would say no. I remember Hillary Clinton accused Canada that all those 19 terrorists that came across the border in 9/11 came from Canada to the United States and then, you know, did what they did. They actually flew straight into the United States. So much for the porosity of the Canadian border. None of them came from Canada. That doesn't mean the Canadian border is porous, but none of those actual, fortunately for Canada and the Canadian government at the time, none of them came from Canada. And the people on the ground in Mexico and in the US were really not concerned about the potential for some terrorist group hooking up. This was the crazy hypothesis they were working that time, was that the terrorist organizations are going to hook up with the narcs, and they're going to pay the narcs to help them get in to the United States through these illegal routes. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, like these narcs like make $1 million a minute, right? How much is Al Qaeda going to pay these narcs to make it worth their while to help terrorists cross into the U.S. Through the U.S. border? Because at the end of the day, if you end up doing that and you end up getting caught, you get yourself put on the radar. So narcs don't want to be put on the radar, and by helping terrorists go into the United States, you're going to put yourself on the radar. And the narc, I mean, that hypothesis was absolutely ridiculous. The difference is the people on the ground back then knew that, like American authorities and Mexican authorities, but especially the American authorities. I wonder nowadays, you know, I mean, we're hearing the terrorist thing, but you could go to a field office in Arizona, a border patrol field office in Arizona, and they will say this: we are protecting the United States against Islamic terrorists that are coming in from Mexico. So these are the actual people on the ground. That's what's changed, and I think that's one of the biggest differences that we see. Let's say from back late 90s, early 2000s, that there was a really big difference between the rhetoric coming out of Presidencia in the US and who was actually running the show on the ground. So back to this idea that after 9/11, the border becomes a national security issue. The three countries signed 2 bilateral agreements called the Smart Border Agreements. Canada and US signed one, and Mexico and US signed another one. In fact, this was the first time Canada and this was the first time the hate between Canada and Mexico became public, because Mexico wanted to sign a trilateral border agreement. The Canadians did not want to sign it trilaterally. the Canadians said, your border is different from our border problems are different from your border problems. We need to open up the border now, because right after 9/11, what the Americans did was national, and this was the phrase, security trumps trade. So they shut the borders, and Canada needed those borders open as soon as possible. So within a few weeks, Canada had negotiated the smart border agreement. Mexico wanted to be part of the bilateral Canada-US one. The Canadians said no. So Mexico Fox ended up signing his own version of it with Bush, a much smaller version, a much shorter version. But you had two smart border agreements. And the idea of the smart border agreement was to this was once described to me really good. You have this big pile of hay, right? And we know that in this pile of hay there's like one or two needles or nails, and those are the terrorists, but we don't know where they are. And there's two ways to do this. What you can do is you can go in there and start looking for them, or you can take away the hay until you're left with only with the needles. And that's what the smart border agreements did, and that's what they continue to do to a certain point. It's what they do is they take away the pieces of hay, they identify safe travelers, safe businesses, they pre-identify them, they pre-clear them, and in fact, that's the phrase, it's pre-clearance. As they're safe, they're not terrorists, and that makes the pile from this big to that small, so that you can focus your limited resources on only that small little pile of hay and a couple of nails. The Canadians and the Americans applied their version of the smart border agreement literally within months. I mean, literally within months, and it was much more profound than the Mexico-US one. One of the reasons. There's a couple of reasons why we didn't have a trilateral one. One was because the Canadians were willing to go a lot further. In the case of Canada, which still exists today, and they created something called IBETs, Integrated Border Enforcement Teams, where you have joint tactical units that are functioning along the border, that have arrest authority across the border, that they can cross into the border. You can see New York State Police in Montreal, and you can see Chef-d'État in Quebec in Vermont, and they have arrest authority under the laws of the country that they're in, but you can actually that actually happens. And these units are small, they're investigative, but what it did was it just made getting over the border and dealing with potential threats just so much more efficient. These IBETs, of course, you have to make an assumption there, which is that sovereignty is not an issue. In fact, that you have to make an assumption that sovereignty is shared, that you see the same threat. The threat is the same thing for both countries. So the best way to do it is let's do it together. In the case of Mexico, IBETs wouldn't work. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that there is this perception that, yeah, we should work with, every time I give a talk somewhere with the military, it's like, cooperación con Estados Unidos siempre y cuando se respete la soberanía mexicana. I don't know how many times I've heard that phrase. Cooperación con Estados Unidos siempre y cuando se respete la soberanía mexicana. It's like, enough already. You know what? They often don't work together, for one, but it's an obsession. And there's just no way you can get these IBETs working on the Mexico-US side, as they did in the Canada-US side. And that's a big reason why the Canadians didn't want to bring Mexico into the discussions post 9/11 about the smart border agreement. I don't know if you know this, but if you've ever been to Canada and you're flying to the United States, you're going to go through US Customs and Immigration in Montreal or Toronto or Vancouver. You're going to go through US Immigration and Customs in Canada. So in other words, when you're flying to the United States, you're flying on a plane that's been pre-cleared. Everybody's been checked by American. In other words, it's been given the green light to go and land to the national part of the airport in Chicago, which is wonderful because that means you don't have to wait in those horrendous lines of 3 hours. But the other advantage of that is that if anything ever happens on that plane, you were the ones who said the plane was ready to go. You authorized it taking off. You vetted everyone that's on the plane. You checked the plane. So it takes the responsibility away from Canada, and that's been the Canadian strategy. Has been to, like, you're worried about something, you take care of it. If you're worried about it, we'll let you take care of it. We won't stop you from taking care of it. And that hasn't been the case in the Mexico-US case. You know, the Mexicans have been very jealous of, like, if we're going to do anything, we're going to do it under our terms, and we're going to do it. I mean, at least that's the official rhetoric for Lomez. So a turning point then to make the border from something that's economic into something that's security is 9/11. But again, the issue is terrorism. We're not talking about migrant workers or Central Americans or Venezuelans or as potential threats as criminals. Well, they are, but it's certainly not, you know, on the top of the agenda as it is now. So I think the first big shift in the way you perceive the border from being something that is a national security thing, a construct, a national security, a space for national security is with 9/11. I think before that, we can discuss this, of course. I think before that, the perception was that let's try to make this border as efficient and open as possible to make sure NAFTA works, was the priority. Then after 9/11, things changed. So I guess that's stage two. Stage one is the economic, stage two is terrorism. I think stage three, stage three is the Tea Party stage. I don't know if you've heard of the Tea Party. You may be too young to have heard of the Tea Party. The Tea Party was like Trump Jr., I don't know what you want to call them, but the early version of Trump. In fact, Marco Rubio, who's considered a moderate today, was one of the founders of the Tea Party. The Tea Party was the radical right wing of the Republican Party 20 years, 15 years or so ago. And they were the ones who introduced the concept of, they went beyond they're stealing our jobs, which was the rhetoric then. They went and said they're criminals. You know, so yeah, they're stealing our jobs, but forget the jobs. Because there was always a good answer to they're stealing their jobs. They're doing the jobs no American wants to do. But they took it one step further and said they're criminals. They're coming in here and they're stealing and they're robbing and there's stuff like that. And then they combined it with this idea of we need to know who's in the country because of the 9/11 thing. So you get the criminal. There's a bunch of people that are in this country that we don't know who they are. Many of them are working in farms in California, earning $2 an hour at best if they're lucky. But at the same time now, since 9/11, they've become a threat. They weren't before. Now they're a threat. And the threat is that they're criminals and we don't know who they are. And they may be going around killing and robbing and stealing, and there's nothing we can really do because they're coming back and forth. The Tea Party, in other words, at least from my perspective, is the element that introduced the idea that linked the national security element, which was terrorism for 9/11, to the criminal part of the migrant. And it wasn't until Trump that we ultimately saw, but we still, as people who do security, we separate national security from criminal. They're not the same thing. We treat them differently. They're managed in different ways. We use different tools and so forth. So the Tea Party still considered the treatment or the management of the criminal aspect in a law enforcement type of way. They just wanted more of it. It wasn't until Trump that we start to see this blurring of the distinction between national security and crime. And I mean, the blurring of the distinction, to the moment that distinction was blurred was when he made that famous speech where he said there are murderers, there are rapists, and they're doing this. Because in that speech he made a whole bunch of other statements that we don't pay attention. Yeah.
Saki, ¿por qué crees que se volvió tan popular esto? Porque era una idea pues medio marginal con el Tea Party, pero de repente se...
The Tea Party?
Sí, digo, en términos de la idea, era, pues no mucho la compraba. Y con Trump esto se
explotó.
Explotó. Era que la sociedad, algo cambió en la sociedad o es Trump.
I mean, it would be something off the top of the head, off the top of my head. I haven't really thought about why the shift in public opinion, but it's a very good point. You would not be able to, the Tea Party weren't started gaining influence and ultimately Trump, if it wasn't for the fact that there was a shift in public opinion in the United States. I can give you the really easy answer, which is that the US has always gone through these shifts. Historically, you know, the US that, you know, the US that I grew up with in the 80s, or in the 70s or the 90s was not the common, you know, the internationalist US. Internationalism not necessarily meaning like a good thing. It could mean going to Vietnam, it could mean US aid, it could mean both things. But that's a very narrow historical period, right? I mean, it's post-World War II up until the tendency historically in the United States is to be very isolationist. And I think what happened what did happen end of Cold War was there were calls for a return to isolationism. And that isolationist rhetoric tended to be linked to a lot of the foreigners bad. Nothing good comes from outside the United States. And that would be the really easy, cheap answer to your question, that all that the United States did in the 90s was just kind of go back to the way they were in the 1920s and before that. Because historically, I mean, since the founding of the country, up until World War I, the US said, this is none of our business. We don't want any of these damn foreigners. The exception was the Cold War. It was people like Roosevelt that started this shift. And perhaps the end of the Cold War, because of the calls for return to isolationism, and because isolationism in the US often is associated with some of the more nastier things that we're discussing. Maybe, I don't know. It's the best I can give you at this point without really thinking about it. But it is a good question. Why the shift? Because it's not only the US that's seeing this. We're seeing it in a lot of other parts of the world. Countries that really didn't have a tradition like this. Right. So if it was only the US, then what I'm saying now kind of says, all right, we can hold a little bit of water. But that we're seeing it everywhere in Europe, especially in Europe, is particularly troublesome. People have identified the 2008 crisis as a turning point. People lost a lot of money. People lost a lot of homes. People started getting fed up. Anger emerged with 2008. You know, that phrase. Maybe that's actually, the economist would probably say 2008. That explains everything. But yeah, there is. Sí hay una diferencia marcada después de 2008. And the Tea Party is around there. Maybe that's a better answer. But that the 2008 crisis had a massive impact on the US. It didn't hit us, I'm not so sure how hard it hit us, fortunately here at ITAM. We didn't feel it so much, but as a country, I know Canada didn't get hit hard. I know Europe got hit really hard. The AFD, for example, emerges directly as a result of the 2008 crisis. And the housing crisis in the US, the housing defaults in the US post 2008, the white anger could link up to the Tea Party. But it is a good question, something to think about more carefully. Trying to recover from that, Trump links this up. So when he gives that speech about the criminals, it's when he talks about criminals, rapists, murderers, terrorists, nuclear weapons, everything. It's all in there. It's one giant mishmash. And the criminal becomes linked with the national security of Trump. And I think what we're seeing right now is the result of that linkage. That the people calling the shots in the US really don't understand that there are different issues that require different mechanisms to manage. And they just lump them in with the same, the problem to the migrant solution is the same to the criminal, is the same to the 9/11 terrorist, is the same to the nuclear package, or it's just the same thing. And in that sense, what is different today is that from what I'm seeing, remember I made this distinction between, in the Bush period, this is what Bush would say. He probably didn't really believe it. And I can guarantee you that people on the ground didn't believe it. Now, some recent trips that I've done, you do see it. I mean, you see it everywhere. You see it all the way up, down. And some of these, some of it has to do with a lot of these border patrol people that have come in now into the US, who are being assigned to the southern border, are Afghan and Iraq vets. So they're already going in there screwed up. So that's basically that's the person that's at the border between Mexico and the US. And the evolution of, I thought of doing this, bringing in the pictures, but it would have meant like going back 15 years and showing you the same border in Arizona, and to show you how it's changed visually. I'll put it together and I'll email it to you so you can see what it looked like in like the 80s, the 90s, the late 90s, the early 2000s. It's something else. It's incredible the way it's been. It looks like Afghanistan. It looks like, the green zone in Afghanistan when it didn't back then. Okay, so this puts all the blame then on Trump, right? And the people. Well, no, this is where you guys are gonna get mad at me. The thing is, this is something we've been talking about for 40 years now. The border has been a problem one way or another for 40 years. And there have been multiple opportunities to fix the border. I can name off the top of my head 2 or 3, and I can give you a couple of anecdotes as well. After 9/11, right, we signed the Smart Border Agreement. Mentioned that, right? Okay, well, so did Canada. And I mentioned in the case of Canada, the United States, the Smart Border Agreement, everything was implemented in it within months. So much so that within a year, they signed something else called Beyond the Borders. That's a really bad time to be talking about Canada-US relations being wonderful, but let's just forget about what's happened in the last couple of months. Ignore what Trump has been saying about the 51st state and Governor Trudeau. But I mean, it worked so well, the Smart Border Agreement, that we decided to go even further than that. And we signed the Beyond the Borders Agreement, which was which was exactly what it sounds like, beyond the borders. And I don't know if you've noticed this, and it's still the case. You know, when you arrive at an airport in the US, a major airport in the US, they have the line for everyone. And then there's the line for US citizens and Canadians. Have you noticed that? Because like whenever I'm landing in Chicago or something like that from Mexico, and we're waiting in line there, and like, you know, everybody's getting off the Era Mexico flight, and we're all gonna, oh fuck, we're gonna be here for 2 hours. I just like, I'm going that way. And he said, oh no, that's for Americans. And I said, no, it says Canadian there under. I'm Canadian. Eso no es para mexicanos. Yo soy canadiense, cabrón. So that's an example of what beyond the borders gets you. And this is a debate, an endless debate that I've had with the various authorities in this country, especially the military, giving these kinds of examples of let's make life easier for us, like by introducing beyond the borders or the IBETS thing, or the golden, I call it the golden brick road. And the response uniformly across the Mexican side, and this is where you guys are going to get mad at me, is no. Why? Eso no es una soberanía mexicana. And my response, I know, so you're willing to wait 3 hours in line in Chicago to get into Chicago? Yeah, I'd rather do that than have pre-clearance. And there's something wrong with you then. And I bet if we did a survey here and I asked you guys, what do you think about pre-clearance? What do you think about going through US immigration? Peña Nieto's original airport, before it was canceled, because it was a bad project, horrible project. They're listening to me, so had pre-clearance. Part of the airport was going to have an area for pre-clearance. Maybe that's why AMLO got so pissed off about it. But you would have gone if you were flying to, and this only applies to flying to the U.S. So if you're flying from Montreal to like Paris, no, it's only for flights going into the U.S. So if you were flying from Mexico to the U.S., you would have gone through pre-clearance. You would have gone through U.S. immigration and customs in Mexico and flown straight to the national part of Chicago Airport. Oh my God, qué belleza. But I bet if I did a survey with you guys here, half of you would say, no, la soberanía mexicana. I'm looking at one guy back there is looking at me saying, vamos a aplicar el 33 al cabrón. I'm sure I can find at least one person in this, and I know I speak among friends here, so, and a lot of we all kind of think alike, but I'm sure I can find at least one person who would say, no, that's not a good idea. Beyond the borders, especially. I mean, not smart border, beyond the border. And I'm not going to ask because I don't want to get beaten up after class. But I will tell you this though: every time I've had this kind of discussion, the similar discussion with the military, 100% guaranteed, no way, no way. And I was like, why? No. So violación de soberanía. And then you'll throw stuff like, well, what about the Greek embassy in Polanco? I mean, that's Greek territory. Why are you willing to do that? Well, that's different. Well, how? Why is it different? Well, because it's different. It's an embassy. Okay, well then convince yourself that what you're at the airport is an embassy. Because actually it is. It's the same legal status. No. 100%. You know, I'm not 97%, 100% of the military. This is why I no longer get invited by the military. It all stopped when AMLO got elected. I used to get invited a lot by the military all the time, and I would argue about these kinds of things. But at least we would argue about it, right? AMLO gets elected, then the invitations stop. It's like,
there you go.
There you go. Yes, what a surprise. But it's stunning. The perception. And people say, you're Canadian, you don't get it. And I say, fine, all right, it's time to change, get over it. And I always give them this example. You're making the assumption that cooperation, you know, beyond the borders is gonna come, first, you gotta have friendship, and then you take the step to cooperation. But it doesn't work like that. It's never worked like that. As an IR person, I can say very clearly from historical experience, it's the other way around. Countries cooperate, then they become friends. And the best example I can give you is Europe after World War II. These people hated each other, but they were forced to cooperate because the Americans said, screw this, you're not going to do this again. This is the last time. We've come here twice. We've, enough is enough. So we're going to force you to cooperate. And then the result was they ended up kind of liking each other, sort of. Not really, but kind of. Not that much, but cooperation comes before friendship. And the Canada-US experience isn't that we're both white and we both speak English. It's we hated each other in the beginning. We were both after the same territory. But we ended up learning that we needed to cooperate on certain things. And then that cooperation ultimately led over 100 years to what the relationship was like up until 6 weeks ago. It's uniformly, the response is just, so on that one, you know what? Los culpa a ustedes. Perdón, con todo respeto, but and there have been opportunities because the smart border agreement, we're in trouble with the Americans on fentanyl and migrants, but we're doing a damn good job at proving to the Americans that there's more fentanyl coming in from Canada, from the US into Canada and vice versa. Plus, we said we're going to spend $1.3 billion on border security. We've already spent it. We just lied to Trump and said that we're gonna, but we have. We've been doing it for the last 20 years. I bet. We've been doing it. We said we're going to set up these joint tactical units. These tactical units exist, and Trump says, oh, well, that's a great idea. You see, I convinced the Canadians to do this, and the Canadians are, you know what, just let him say it. But we've been doing it for like 30 years anyway, so who cares? As long as he's happy. I'm not saying I'm optimistic about how the Canada-US thing is, but on the security side, the Canada-US border, he's got nothing, none of his arguments hold water. On the trade thing, that's a different thing. On the 25% tariff thing, eso es otra cosa. But on the security side, he's got nothing on it. On the Mexican side, I'm sorry to say, he died. He died. And the smart border agreement, right? So, like I said, remember I said Mexico, US signs the smart border, but the Mexico US version of the smart border agreement looks like this. There's parts of the border that are wonderful. I mean, you go to Tijuana now, San Diego, you saw the new airport arrangement thing that I don't know if you've flown through that part of the US, and you see the joint airport infrastructure between the two airports in San Diego, well, the US side and the Tijuana side. That's an example of like smart border technology. But you'll see that there. But then forget it. Arizona looks like Afghanistan. And then you go to El Paso, Juarez, and it's wonderful again all of a sudden. El Paso, Juarez looks ugly, but it looks ugly. But in terms of the efficiency, going back and forth, it's incredibly well done. So we did do the smart border thing with the Americans like this, but we did it like this, as opposed to like this. And in the case of Canada, it wasn't because the Canadians insisted on making sure that the smart border agreement was signed. Because I guess perhaps the Canadians had the foresight to say that if we don't do this now, this may come up later. So we better do it now. And we had to push the Americans to do the smart border. It was our suggestion, in fact, smart border. I bet it was our suggestion. Pre-clearance at the airports, you think it was the Americans that wanted to put, American embassy at the Montreal airport. It wasn't. It was a Canadian idea. We wanted them for business reasons, just to be able to make travel efficient. Again, because we just don't see it as a sovereign threat. So we applied that. And then because we applied it, we went to beyond the borders. in the case of Mexico, it still looks like this. It's been 30 years. How many years is that? It still looks like this. There's parts that you'll go at the border that you'll say, wow, like San Diego, you know, or Tijuana. But there's parts that you're gonna say, holy fucking crap. I mean, nothing's been done here. Nothing. Absolutely nothing's been done. And he's got a point. I'm sorry, but he's got a point when he says this, because we've had 40 years to do this. There were other opportunities. We signed another agreement called this La Alianza para Seguridad y Prosperidad, which was going to be beyond the borders. I don't know if you ever heard of that one. I know you're all too young to know what that sounds. La Alianza para Seguridad y Prosperidad. It didn't work out, but it did, because the beyond the borders, one that I just mentioned right now, is the US version of La Alianza para Seguridad y Prosperidad. So on the three-way option of beyond the borders, it didn't work. But Canada, US, it worked. And I know you're gonna say, it's because you're white. It's because you both speak English and all that kind of stuff. It isn't. Okay. And when Trump won the first time, and I'll finish with this because I know I'm gonna get eaten alive in the next few moments. When Trump first gets elected, when my relationship with these people was still good, because now all the way down. The one place that I had a good relationship was CESIG, and they made that disappear, so I'm finished there as well. I remember having once Trump was elected, the person from la Policía Federal que estaba encargado de las fronteras. I used to teach at Constituyentes where the Policía Federal was, so I got to know a lot of these characters, and they're interesting. And they're nice people too. A lot of the Policía Federal, I regret the day they ripped apart the Policía Federal. There were problems with the Policía Federal, but they're a much better option. But that's another discussion. There's some competent people. This person was a competent person. And I remember having lunch with him at Sanborn's, and he's like having a total freak out. And he's telling me that shit, Trump won. This is the first time. Trump won, and the border. This was the whole, you know, murderers and rapists. Did anything really happen at the border the first time Trump won? No. Did we do anything? No. Could we have done something? Maybe. And that was my conversation with Bermeo. And I told Bermeo, I said, Bermeo, put a plan together to fix the border. Go to the Americans, present it to them, because it's not going to work the other way. The Americans are too busy. There's too many things on their table. They're too busy invading Afghanistan and Iraq and stuff like that. You need to go to them. The Canadians go to the Americans with these plans, not the other way around. Go to them with a plan, present them the plan. This is our plan to make this a smarter border, a better border between Mexico and the United States. And he's like, I don't know, Saki, it's too late. And I said, it's never too late. It's never too late. And he told me 8 years ago, was it now? 10 years ago, it's too late. It's too late, it's too late. We're screwed, we're screwed. No, Bermeo. And not only that, the Americans are gonna pay for it. If you go with the plan, the Americans are gonna put the money for it, because you're gonna say, we don't have the money for this. Or we're willing to do this. We're willing to do pre-clearance, right? But you're gonna have to put the money for it, because we don't have the money for the infrastructure. So can you pay for it? And the Americans say, yeah. But again, if I do a sondeo here, how are you gonna say no? And Bermeo, you know what Bermeo did? Well, you can guess what Bermeo did. He didn't do what I told him to do. And that was 10 years ago, 8 years ago. Now, if Bermeo had, you know, maybe if Bermeo had if the Policía Federal, who at that point were in charge of the borders, officially anyway, had actually put forward a plan, a real plan for the border, we may not necessarily be in the mess that we are in. And this is not to defend Trump. This is just to highlight the fact that the border is a mess. And for years, the two countries did a great job of kind of hiding it, pretending it isn't really there, ignoring it, compartmentalizing it, doing what most countries do, which is, we have this issue, we're going to deal with this issue. This is another issue, we're going to deal with that issue separately. That's what most countries do. They don't bring everything together. Well, yeah, we got unlucky. We got a guy who brings everything together. But that's not to say that he's making up stuff. I'll leave you with that stuff. I'll leave you with that idea. And I don't know if Vidal is happy or upset or
I have a question.
Yeah.
Pero supongo que México hace un plan. Uno de los principales problemas que presenta Trump es la inmigración no autorizada, ¿no? ¿Es realista pensar que es posible parar eso?
Traveling borders on this.
Yes.
That's another example of something we've done nothing about in the last 40 years. Is it realistic to stop? I'm not quite sure. Are you saying, is it realistic to stop the Central Americans and the Venezuelans or the migration in general?
En general, porque pues, como que la queja es, está entrando gente no autorizada de Estados Unidos y están matándonos, violándonos.
At this point, it may be too late.
Maybe too.
It may be too late because I don't see Trump. I don't see Trump as being the last person to carry this. I mean, we'd have to have such a radical change politically. It may be too late. You know, when Bermeo was saying it's too late, he may be right now that it's too late. Because in the minds of 400 million Americans, all these things are linked up now.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't though. That was my earlier point. You know, the kid that's asking Bush and Reagan,
mm-hmm.
Who both, by the way, were in favor of migration in that debate, strangely enough. He was asking specifically about the use of medical services. It wasn't about the criminal stuff. I mean, your question is, can we go back to that? I'm not so sure anymore. And the reason for that has to do with the changes that are only happening in the United States. It's a global thing, which is very, very, very troubling. We're seeing this kind of populist shift.
Incluso en México, ¿no? Si ve la nota roja, robaron una casa a venezolanos.
Really?
Sí, o sea, siempre hay la nacionalidad.
Okay, well, it depends on the populist wave, right? And is it going to end? I don't know. The last time it ended, we ended up killing 80 million of each other before we got to it. I'm not saying we're going to get to something like that, although who knows? Well, after Europe, no, I think you may be right. I think you and Bermeo may finally be right that it's just too late. It just in the mind of the average American, all these things are together. They're all together. I mean, the 9/11, the Mexican, the Venezuelan, the job, the medical services, the hotels in New York City that are full. It's all connected. It's one phenomenon. It's the migrant.
No pasarás aquí porque casi que la solución está integrada en el problema, en el sentido en que Trump dijo, está este problema, así ya lo planteó, seguridad, migración, yo lo voy a resolver. En el caso de seguridad, lo que ha pasado antes es, por resolverlo significa atrapamos al Chapo, decomisamos 2 camiones con droga, y ya está, ya hice algo.
Yeah, he makes
No
his-
pasará igual con migración, que bueno, pusimos 2 kilómetros más de
exactly, yeah, which is what he did last time around, right? And he claimed victory. And that would be nice. It could happen. In fact, it's probably going to happen because we're seeing it happen in the case of Canada and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there's a difference this time though. This time Trump's got his people in there, and these people want the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we solved the security thing. Let's say that Benamil finally does his job, although unfortunately he's probably unemployed now after changes in the last few years. Let's say all these things happen, or let's say your option, which is like you pick off a couple of boxes and you claim victory. We still have the other problem, which is like the 25%, the tariff issue, because they're separate. The security, right? They were presented simultaneously, right? But they're not. The tariff thing and the border security thing are separate issues. One of them is they're criminals. The other one is Americans should be building cars, not Canadians and Mexicans. So even if he claims that victory, I don't see the tariff thing being resolved as easily as possibly the way that you suggested that it might happen. But that could be a way out on that issue. Yeah, I'm actually much more worried about the trade thing. Personally, I think the trade thing is this could be the end of North American free trade. Unless that's part of his plan is to convince all of us that he means business. But that's the problem with this guy. Like he says, I'm not faking, and he's not. Nine times out of 10, he's not. 1 out of 10, he is. So, yeah, but and we do need to add this part because much of the discussion when I was talking about the migrant issue being the issue, we were talking about mostly Mexicans, and the numbers were much lower. So the issue, the problem, whatever you want, it exploded in the last 10 years. I mean, it was, and in fact, most Mexicans actually, most migrants aren't actually Mexican. They're mostly from other countries, Central America and South America. It's become the migrant thing in and of itself has become a much bigger thing. So the Americans, when they were arguing, when Reagan and Bush were arguing about it in 1982 or 85 or whatever it was this big, right? Now it's huge from their perspective. Well, I don't know if that makes it even worse then, I guess, doesn't it, right?
Sí. Sí, ahora si no es posible resolverlo, pues te conformas. Como si quieres que el niño se coma toda la sopa, después de 2 horas de discutir, 2 cucharadas.
Yeah. The other thing that maybe if you want to see this, following the possible optimistic option that you suggested, he's worked out arrangements where some of these people stay, or are being taken by friendly regimes, or El Salvador, el acuerdo que tiene con Bukele, ¿no? De decidir
O Canadá. O que se vayan a Canadá
todos. O se vayan a Canadá todos, sí. We have a problem. We need people.
All them rich.
I don't know if you've heard, but it's all ICE. We could use those. Yeah, all the rich narcos. Yeah, man. We'll tax them. But that's another option. All that he makes these kinds of arrangements. But the Trumpism phenomenon, I don't think is dead with Trump. Yeah, totally.
I have a question. You said that 10 years ago, well, we have a chance to solve the issues in the border. So if you were the guy that say, okay, I have to write to plan to make this border work, how would you do it? Would you say, okay, I need more cops, or I need to report the judicial system, or any policy that you may
Yeah,
this is necessary?
yeah, I mean, if there was one real quick way to summarize the idea of smart borders, transparency. So that we both know what's coming over the border almost simultaneously. So any kind of mechanism that's designed to share information between the United States and Canada, or the United States and Mexico, any kind of mechanism that shares information, in some cases in real time, would help. Like pre-clearance, for example, is a classic example. I mean, you can't get more transparent and open about it, but there's other mechanisms. Are you asking for like something really, a concrete example of something that can be done at the border? Like,
I mean, a general scrap plan, for a way to say, like main ideas, or
okay, well, some of the components of this, let's be an ideal smart border agreement would have transparency. This transparency would take different forms: pre-clearance, pre-identification. Pre-identification means that you're a pre-authorized traveler. Pre-clearance means you're pre-authorized for the travel that day. But there's another option where you're pre-authorized permanently for the rest of your life. The program here is called Global Entry. You can go through that if you want to, and then you'll never have trouble at the border ever in your life again in the US. But you got to go through Global Entry. And in Global Entry, they're going to ask you everything, and you're going to have to tell them everything. Now, it's a question of, are you willing to give up your civil rights in order to make the border more efficient? As a Canadian, I just want to get over the border as fast as I can. I couldn't care less. But yeah, it's not a national or personal security issue for me. So there's that. There's also other mechanisms, other types of pre-clearance for cargo. What they do in Mexico, in some places, and what they do a lot in Canada, they pre-seal trucks. So they'll pre-seal a truck in Tijuana. You'll have a U.S. immigration, a U.S. customs rather, in Tijuana. Yes, they're there. I hope you're not worried about that. So you have U.S. customs in Tijuana that are like sealing the truck. I don't know if they're actually putting a seal. And then that truck goes through a special lane to the US and drives straight to its destination, where the seal is then opened up at the point of destination. And you don't have to wait through the lines, because the line is the pile of hay. This line is, we've cleared that you're not in the hay line anymore. You know, we know you're not a needle, so you can just go through. But to get to that point, companies, individuals have to give up a lot of information. And that's something that it is at the end of the day. If you come back to me and say, but these are civil rights, I mean, they could very easily ask you, for example, the Global Entry, give me your phone for a couple of days. And give me your password for a couple of days. I don't want to do that. Well, too bad. It ain't gonna happen. But you'd be amazed at how many Canadians are willing to do that. Most Canadians, because most Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, they have it already. So you have like the fast lanes. There's two types of lanes in Mexico and in the US. You have like the fast lanes, where you just drive right through, and the lane where they have to interview. The fast lane is the one you want to go through, but to be able to go through that, you've got to give all that information. So pre-clearance, pre-identification, sealing vehicles, simultaneous transmission of information. So as you drive up to the US border to go into Canada, they've taken a picture of your car, they've taken your plates, they know who you are. The Americans are collecting this information because you're on the US side. They've collected this information on you. And they've passed it to the Canadians. So by the time you actually get to the Canadian border, if you're at the physical border itself, they know more about you than you know about you. And then the same thing happens the other way. As you're driving from Montreal to go to New York City, to New York State, right? All the information on your vehicle, your tags, everything is being photographed and categorized and so forth. And it's being sent to US authorities. So by the time you actually get there, they know more about you than you. And it makes it faster. It really does. The problem is it's starting to sound like Xi Jinping's China. So those are a couple of things that come to mind immediately. I bets. I didn't write it. Did I write it? No, I didn't. I wrote it yesterday. That's why I keep on going back there. The integrated border enforcement teams, right? The jointly patrol. Yeah. Trust has to increase. One of the biggest problems that we have between Mexican, and it's improving, but we're still not there, is that we fundamentally speaking, we just don't trust each other. Right? It's still there. There are person-to-person relationships that work well, but as institutions, there is this lack of trust. You know, the way that, think of a typical TV show where like the FBI says, okay, something's happening in Baltimore. What's the closest unit? Baltimore local police. All right, send a unit there. Right? The FBI knows that the Baltimore police is going to do their job. You don't know that with each other, institutionally speaking. So there's a lack of trust on the institutions that needs to. It's been getting better, but it does this in many instances. One thing that would help a lot are those IBETs, where you actually have people on the ground together, working together, sharing information on the ground, patrolling the border together. I mean, the day I see Americans and Mexican border patrol officers of any stripe working on the border together, walking together across back, is the day that I've done my job. Stuff like that. But do you see something like that happening? You know how you can create a crap load of trust with Trump on the issue of the border? IBETs. Because then the Americans are going to have access to the US side. Americans are going to have access to the Mexican side. They're going to see what's happening on this side. Are you willing to do that?
Well,
no.
Me personally.
Yeah, no, actually, yeah, I'm asking you personally. Are you?
Yes, but
Okay.
I believe that.
But you're the minority.
Yes.
But that's what it's going to need. I mean, if we're going to get close to what you were saying before, if we're going to take baby steps towards what you were saying, these would be good baby steps. Maybe they won't get us all the way we want to go, but they certainly wouldn't hurt. I mean, as far as, you know, not the sovereignty thing. I gotta be careful with this. Like, you know how many times they've almost beat the crap out of me after. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a question of what is it that you want out of the relationship with the other country. You know, this is why this whole thing with Trump has shocked Canadians so much, because for over 100 years, it's like, where is this coming from? We have a 150-year tradition of like working together on everything. We don't have treaties. It's all ad hoc. There's over 300 ad hoc agreements. The IBETs, okay, actually the IBETs are in the treaty, but many of these arrangements, border arrangements, are just like memorandums of understanding between the two countries that have evolved over 100 years or so. And then all of a sudden Trump comes and does this, and we're like, where's this coming? This has never happened before. I guess we're kind of feeling what you guys kind of feel for the last 100 years or so. Yeah.
Pero eso no justo fortalece el argumento de México. O sea, decir, es un poco el issue del huevo y la gallina, ¿no?
Sí.
Confianza institucional y después los ILACs, o primero las ILACs y después confianza institucional. Pero esto que pasó con Canadá, no justo fortalece el argumento de si cooperamos, puede venir Trump Jr. y...
I know, but that's like, no, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because Trump shocked everyone. Nobody was expecting that, not even. So I mean, you're picking. It's like almost like, I don't want to accuse you of this because you're not doing that. It's a good example. You're kind of like cherry picking, right?
Yeah.
You're saying, all right.
Yeah.
So over the last 100 years, we've had semi-decent presidents on them, crappy than Trump. The asshole. There, we've been right all along for the last 300 years. Well, no.
Yeah.
Okay. And as a Canadian, I gotta try to be optimistic and hope that it might end with just this. But I'm not so optimistic anymore. But yeah, it does tell you something. Something that the Canadians learned the hard way is that look, this is not in the US interests, what they're doing. I mean, Trump is messing with the US. I mean, and even its own national security.
Yeah.
But whatever they think is important for them, they're gonna come first. And that's something that I don't think Canadians realized up until now. That we always had this idea that we're always gonna find a way. You know, and then we all kind of equals and kind of we just found out the hard way we're not equals.
Yeah.
And that is with or without Trump. So in that case, yes, you do have a point. But you're saying that that's been Mexico's perception now for 150 years, and that's the reason why it's affected the relationship?
No, pero ahora en mediano plazo, it's too late. I mean, for now.
Yeah. Yeah, but I wouldn't worry about the word. I wouldn't worry about that. I mean, I really wouldn't. I mean, this will. We're all gonna end up starving. I mean, if this agreement comes, the three economies are so intertwined that to break them apart, it's going to be devastating. It's exactly what China wants. So that's why I said, like, Trump is doing it, you know, like going against U.S. national interests. But this is going to be a devastating thing. And you know, to criticize my country, we're willing to go bilateral with the United States. The worst thing we can do is go bilateral, because at least in a trilateral arrangement, there is this institutional element to it, right? In the case of NAFTA, even though they never paid attention to it, by the way, neither did Mexico or Canada, but the dispute resolution mechanism was something that was NAFTA beyond just a trade agreement, right? If Canada and US just sign an agreement just between the two of them, leaving Mexico out, which like I said, the Canadians are willing to do, then you're going to take away that institute. Then you're going to see this imbalance that the Canadians really don't want. So I'm not saying that Canada and Mexico need to work together. I'm not saying that Canada and Mexico together can balance the United States. The Americans would. If Mexico went to Canada and said, "Hey, let's get together and balance the Americans," the Canadians would say, "Good fucking on that one. I hope it works out for you." But to keep the relationship together in order to have at least the semblance of some kind of institutional linkage, I think it's important. And it worries me that the Canadians are willing to sign only with the US and throw the Mexicans out. That's actually my biggest concern, that Canada and the US are going to work it out. Like even the 25%, the border thing, they're going to work out. I'm sure of it. We'll bet on it, okay? The 25%, I'm almost sure Canada and US are going to, they can't. I mean, the factories, you can see them. I mean, it's not like Mexico where you have, like they are actually like 100 kilometers apart, right? I mean, the maquiladora is like 70 kilometers from the factory on the US side. In the Canada-US, this evolved in World War II, where they had to build tanks. they didn't care about sovereignty. It was like, where are we gonna get workers to build these tanks? Ford has these factories in Detroit, but we need workers. Where are the closest workers? Across the river on Canada. They didn't think about sovereignty. It was like the Nazis. So the whole auto industry is, can you believe it? The auto industry is the result of the Second World War and the production of tanks and airplanes to fight the Nazis. And then it eventually became what it is now. But you can see these factories across the river. You can't break that. So I think they're going to work that one out also. I'm not so sure the Mexicans and the Americans are going to be able to, because the Mexicans might get hard-headed. Correctly so, by the way. You know, this is the Greek in me speaking. But I know Canadians. I know Canadians are going to, remember what I said before about Canadians? You know what? If it's going to make you happy, as long as it doesn't mess with me, go ahead, do it, right? There were FBI in Montreal arresting people after 9/11. We couldn't care less. You know what? They're doing their job. Thank you very much. But that Canadian attitude, which is like live and let live, and we don't consider you a threat to sovereignty, I don't see it here. Can I give you one last example? I know you want to leave.
Creo que tenemos que cortar ya.
Here's a funny story. You remember the balloons from China? Okay, so there's this, you know that there's this bilateral command. There's a joint command, NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense. So there were Chinese balloons flying over Canada, and Trudeau says, we have to defend our sovereignty, so we're activating NORAD. And a couple of American F-35s are going to come in to shoot down those planes. And I'm thinking like a Mexican and saying to myself, hold on a second, you're going to defend Canadian sovereignty with 2 American F-35s? To a Canadian, it's completely normal sound. Yeah. But I was thinking for a moment, like as a Canadian, as a Mexican, saying that's real. But that's the way Canadians think. Por eso pienso que final de cuentas los canadienses y los gringos sí están capaces de firmar una